So, as we now know, the trailer that you showed at the Sony press conference is just a playable teaser. It's not part of the full game, from what I understand. So I was wondering if you can tell us what players can expect from the full Resident Evil 7.
今回の、ソニーさんのカンファレンスで流れた
So actually, if you take a look at the trailer that was revealed at the Sony press conference, and that's online now, there are quite a few images from the main game in there. So when you have a chance, please take a look and see if you can find some of those. And kind of going off that to the demo that we have on the PlayStation Network right now was especially created to focus on the atmosphere that Resident Evil 7 will provide. It doesn't include a lot of other elements that are in the game. Rather, we wanted to convey just what type of feeling you would get from the game. In the actual game, one thing you'll notice first and foremost is that the scale and scope of the game is much bigger than the demonstration, so he feels that there's a lot more content and a lot greater scope to look forward to in the final game.
So you'd mentioned that the full game will include sort of more mechanics, and this was really all about atmosphere. I was wondering if you could comment on what some of those mechanics might be. For example, what role will combat play? I mean, Resident Evil games have always had some sort of gunplay in them, so I was curious what role combat will play and sort of what other gameplay mechanics will be included in the full game.
そうですね。今回の配信版で
But one of the things he would like to emphasize about this is that it's not always about going in guns blazing. It might actually be the best, be to your advantage actually to try to run away from combat at certain times, or use items to against your enemies in a different way. This is to say that surviving, trying to survive the horror, the survival horror, is a key element to Resident Evil 7.
So obviously this is a pretty big departure from Resident Evil 6. The franchise has been moving more and more in an action-oriented direction. So I was wondering why the decision to now return to horror, and to what extent is the game committed to horror? I mean, how empowered will players be by the end of the game? Will they feel sort of superpowered, or will they always be sort of threatened and scared throughout the entire experience? So yeah, why the return to horror, and to what extent is the entire experience horror?
最初の質問なんですけれども、
Addressing the first question, why the move to horror, one of the main driving factors was simply listening to the desires of consumers. Consumers have often told us very strongly, very passionately that they want a return to horror. So this was one of the main driving factors. Also, from a creative standpoint, it's kind of refreshing, and it's also easier to make a much more kind of user-friendly and easy to understand game for the user if it's more focused. On that note, you might know that this year is the 20th anniversary of Resident Evil, and so as we focused on the horror aspect for Resident Evil 7, we conversely focused on the shooting aspect for our game Umbrella Corps, and so we feel that by kind of being very focused on each of these elements, we can create different games that are easy to understand for the player and easy to get into.
So sort of an obvious question. I was just curious how this game will tie into the larger Resident Evil universe. I mean, will we see anything from Umbrella Corps or Wesker, or Chris Redfield, any of the returning sort of characters or elements that have, defined the series over all these years? So where does this fit into the series, and how much will it feel like a Resident Evil game?
Just somewhat jokingly, one of the things that we can tell you about, the only real thing that we can tell you about right now, is that there are herbs in the game. So that just gives you a hint that there are Resident Evil elements within this game. One of the reasons for setting aside, for example, like the very famous characters and things like that, is to again focus on the horror. If you don't know what's going to happen to you or the person who you're taking the role of in the game, it's much scarier than if you're kind of an iconic character who is eventually going to make it through the day. And also the story itself too. It's hard to read what's going to happen in the story because it's new, as compared to some of the organization and things that you might know in the past. So we know that people understand these, enjoy these elements, and there'll be plenty of connections to those for the player to enjoy. But the story itself and the action itself, I think, is totally new, and we hopefully it's much scarier than maybe perhaps some of the Resident Evil experiences you've had in the recent past.
So I have a bit of a two-part question here. So the first part is, horror games have enjoyed a bit of a renaissance recently, primarily in the indie space. We've seen a lot of smaller titles like Slender or Outlast or Five Nights at Freddy's, a whole number of horror games that have done really well coming from very small teams. I was curious if the Resident Evil developers have been sort of paying attention to those games or have been influenced by them in any way, or how they maybe feel about them and how that might impact Resident Evil.
開発スタッフも含めてですね。
The R&D team definitely plays these games. Checks out to play many different types of games. He hasn't played them personally, but he knows that the staff has, and they've taken a deep look at some of these. And it's actually part of the reason that gave the team the confidence to move to the first-person perspective is these independent games, which have proven that it is a viable perspective for the genre, or just for games in general, and not only the independent games, but FPS has been a very common game structure in the West for a long time, particularly compared to Japan. So looking at these success cases and also just the way people have constructed games around this perspective gave them a lot of confidence in the decision to move to FPS. So really easy to answer example of what being a larger publisher provides us is, for example, the entire game supports VR. So only the backing of a large staff and resources could probably make this happen. So that's a very easy example to speak to from the production perspective. But interestingly enough, with this title, one of the main goals is actually not to make a AAA game. From the get-go, the goal is to make the best B-rank horror movie type of experience, or B-rank horror game, excuse me, that we could achieve. The reason for this thinking is that we don't want the content of the game to be driven by marketing, which is often the case with a AAA game. Instead, we want it to be driven by the creator. So in that respect, it could be even something kind of weird in the game. The creators think that this is entertaining. So taking the B rank route allows us to focus more on horror and an intimate experience, and try to make that particular experience as enjoyable as possible, rather than reaching for something that's kind of more bombastic or by the line, so to speak. So he feels that although the scale of Capcom, of course, is much larger than an independent developer, we like to hope that the kind of spirit of the individual developers working on the title matches kind of the feeling they have when they're creating their games.
So we understand that developer Jordan Amaro is working on this game. I was wondering if you could talk about sort of the value that he's brought, or how pivotal his involvement has been.
個人的に知りたいってことだったらお伝えしますけれども。
Basically, he thinks that the crux of the question is whether or not there are people who worked on the PT demonstration that Konami released, and he could say that there are no staff from on the team now or before that worked on PT at Capcom. However, we were actually creating Resident Evil 7 before PT was announced, and so when we announced it, it was kind of like, oh, they're doing FPS 2. However, now that we've come this far, we can obviously see that what the content of this game is completely different from what the content or the direction that was moving in. So he just wanted to kind of make a point of that they're both horror in the horror genre, but what you'll actually see at the end of the day is completely different. And he also knows from hearing on the backside of the industry in Japan that the staff who worked on it had to work very hard to achieve what they did, and he thinks it looked really great and it had so much promise, and he himself was personally disappointed that it didn't come to fruition. So that was too bad that happened to that project, but he would just like to share the fact that he really loved it.
Yeah. Okay. 以上。
Never mind.
Over.
Never mind.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Appreciate your time.